and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to see all of you here. I'd like to just say a little bit about the logistics for the session, and then I will introduce our speaker. This series, as many of you know, Jiao and I organized it with the idea that often big ideas don't come in journal article form. And there are a lot of scholars, especially senior scholars in our field, who are doing really interesting work and publishing books. And we didn't really have an arena, a venue to talk about those ideas. And so we thought we'd create this series of talks to create that space. The format, as it has been for our previous events, will be starting with a presentation by our speaker, Ed Freeman, for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. When we get to the Q&A part, you can just raise your hands to ask your questions. I know that many of you submitted questions in advance. I'll ask that you repeat your questions here in the session. So once we get there, you can raise your hands and I'll call on people to ask the questions. With that, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Ed Freeman, who truly needs no introduction. I was thinking about what we could say about Ed, and I think it's no exaggeration to say that if it weren't for Ed and his decades of work on stakeholder theory, we would probably not even be using the word stakeholder to talk about the work that all of us do. And certainly we would not be sitting here in the stakeholder interest group at SMS as a convening of all of this work. And so I think I personally owe a great intellectual debt to Ed for all of his contributions over the years. And I know that's true for many, if not all of us here in the room as well. We invited Ed to talk about his most recent book, The Power of And, Responsible Business Without Trade-offs. This is not primarily an academic book. It is a book meant for practitioners. And so we asked Ed to come and talk about the book, but hopefully he can also say a few words about how this might connect to what we're doing in our research and scholarly lives as well. So with that, let me turn it over to Ed. And Ed has very bravely offered to present without any PowerPoint slides or anything like that. So Ed Freeman, Unplugged, over to you.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks for having me here. I'm just gonna. I've had a rocky relationship with the field of strategy for a lot of years. Way back when I got started at Wharton, I thought I was a strategy guy. And when I wrote Strategic Management of the Stakeholder Approach, I wrote it as a strategy, but wrote it as a textbook, as a matter of fact, as dumb as that was. And what I discovered, of course, was that nobody in strategy cared about this one single bit. This was made absolutely clear to me in sometime in the mid-'80s. I was asked to present by Ned Bowman at the Business Policy Division Doctoral Consortium. And I was a lot younger and probably a little more angry than I should have been. And I said something like, well, until we can figure out how strategy and ethics are connected, we need to make strategy optional. And Ned said to me, Ed, what do you mean optional? I said, well, Ned, close the departments, not offer PhDs, not require people to take the course, make the whole thing optional. And I'll never forget the look on Ned's face. And of course, I was never invited to the doctoral consortium ever again, and probably deservedly so. So later, when Jeff Harrison and Maurizio Zollo decided to start the SMS interest group, they got me to be the figurehead, but they were the ones who really did it. So it's a real treat for me to see how the interest group has grown and how the scholarship in strategy on stakeholder theory has grown, even though there's still this reluctance to take on the normative questions. Look, I'm a philosopher. I'm a pragmatist, which means I don't think you can avoid normative questions. You just ignore them. They're there. They're implicit in what you do. But nonetheless, I think that's an area where at least I hope the field as an academic field will grow, rather than in this kind of positivistic, well, there's a world of facts and a world of values, and near the twain shall meet, which I think is not a very interesting view. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this book, but remember, it's a book, and I have two co-authors, Kirsten Martin, who's at Notre Dame. She's a chaired professor at Notre Dame, and Bobby Parmar, who's my colleague, chaired professor here. They both had the misfortune of being PhD students of mine some time ago, and despite that, they've gone on to reasonable careers. And we wrote this book in part because of kind of what we were seeing, and in part to say, look, there's this debate about the ethics of capitalism. It's ongoing, and unless we sort of address it directly, it's not going to get any better. There's an old story of business, which I think we're mired in. We are in, as Richard Rorty would say, we're in the grip of this old story. You know what the old story is: business about the money. It's about profits. It's about even maximizing profits for shareholders, or whatever the current version of that is. Business is best understood, according to the old story, as a bunch of greedy little bastards out trying to do each other in. And people are one-dimensional, self-interested, maximizers, etc. And business ethics is pretty much an oxymoron. So those are the elements of the old story. That's obviously a pastiche of it, but you recognize it. The good news is there are lots of folks out there starting businesses and evaluating businesses on very different grounds. And here I'm only going to mention a few. There's a renewed interest in corporate social responsibility and sustainability. There's something that the finance and accounting people have discovered called ESG, which has been around a very long time, but it's a new trick for them, and that's good. There's social entrepreneurship, a new interest in corporate philanthropy. And then there's a whole bunch of organizations like Just Capital. Richard Branson has one. There's Conscious Capitalism, one I'm on the board of, and inclusive capitalism and connected capitalism and impact investing, et cetera. There are 30 or 40 of these new things. These are real people out using real money to start real businesses that are making a difference. I was in the waning days of the Obama administration, I was at the White House for a meeting. It was actually the Department of Labor, okay, but it sounds cooler to say White House, so I'll just say that. Tom Perez was the Secretary of Labor, and he had called a meeting of all the people who had started these things or been perceived to start these things, and went to what can government do to kind of increase the momentum here. This is a good thing. These are good businesses. And furthermore, kind of what's the brand? What's the right brand for this? And I sat there thinking with all these folks, and it seemed to me that what's the right brand wasn't the best question that could be asked. I thought a better question, and that's all philosophers do, is try to ask better questions. I thought a better question was, what are the 4 or 5 really critical ideas that, however we revise capitalism, however we revise this old story, it has to deal with these 4 or 5 ideas. And so we wrote The Power of And to symbolize this, because it wasn't, and it's the power of and because we didn't see it as throwing out the idea of profits or seeing it as profits versus purpose, or God forbid, stakeholders versus shareholders, something I am so deadly tired of as to not be funny. right? It's both in every case. And so I'll just quickly give you the short spiel on each of these five ideas, and then we can turn to your questions. At least the ones I've seen, I don't think I can answer, but I'll do my best here. And the first idea is this: look, purpose is important. Purpose and profits. We make a mistake about purpose for the most part. Look, I need red blood cells to live, but it certainly doesn't follow that making red blood cells the purpose of my life. Even when, as I did a few years ago, I had both my hips replaced. That's a really fun thing to do one weekend. And I needed to worry about making red blood cells. I mean, I really did. It still didn't follow that making red blood cells was the purpose of my life. Business has to make profits. Let's give our colleagues in finance the benefit of the doubt. Business has to make profits at the weighted average cost of capital, which is their complicated formula that turns out it's always around 10%, but nonetheless, that's their gauge. I don't want to screw around with that. Business has to make money at the WACC, and that's great. But it doesn't follow, at least without a lot more argument, that making money is the purpose of business. It's a necessary condition, but it's not about purpose, it seems to me. Entrepreneurs don't start a business, except sometimes in business school textbooks, to make as much money as they can. Entrepreneurs start a business because they have a vision. They see the world in a way that they want other people to see as well. A guy I know in Copenhagen who started a little restaurant called Noma, that was often seen as the best restaurant in the world. Klaus said, we didn't start Noma to make as much money as we could, because we didn't make any for about 19 years. He made plenty after that, but the idea that, Bill Gates or Steve Jobs or John Mackey or pick your favorite entrepreneur started a business to make as much money as they could, it's probably wrong. They started a business because they're on fire about something. Purpose matters, and purpose and profits have to go together. So however capitalism gets revised, it's got to take account of purpose as well as profits. And you all know all the stuff written about purpose, from Larry Fink to Mackey to the Business Roundtable, etc. The second idea, no surprise, is about stakeholders. It's stakeholders and shareholders. Any business, and this is why in a way I still can't believe that it took a long time for people to sort of come around to the idea that the stakeholder idea, which I've always thought was common sense, is relevant. Any business creates and sometimes destroys, and always has created or destroyed value for customers, suppliers, employees, communities, and the people with the money. That's just what a business does. How could it do anything? How could it do anything else? Building or leading a business means getting these interests going in the same direction. The metaphor I like as an amateur musician is you got to harmonize these interests. In other words, they're interdependent. You don't want to trade them off one versus another. You want to understand how doing this for customers affects what you do for suppliers, affects what you do for communities, etc. Even somebody like me who grew up poor on a dirt farm in Georgia understood that you had to deal with people who could affect you and who you could affect. I mean, that seemed to me to be kind of life 101. And when I wrote Strategic Management, a Stakeholder Approach many, many years ago, I didn't think the stakeholder idea was very interesting. I certainly wasn't the most interesting idea in the book, I thought. I thought the most interesting idea of the book was an idea about purpose and what I called enterprise strategy. No one else thought that was very interesting, but That's the way those things go. My wife reads the book. She was a Wharton MBA. She read the book and said, "Well, this is pretty much common sense. You'll never make a living at this." And the living thing worked out okay. But the idea about creating value for stakeholders is more than just there are lots of them, more than shareholders. Stakeholders have a joint interest. They're interdependent. And this is not very well understood, I don't think, either in business or in the academic world. Trying to get a handle. It's easy to measure stakeholder impact. It's hard to measure the jointness of that impact. How does your strategy for customers affect suppliers? We're starting to see some of that work happen, but it's happening a lot in operations, in supply chain. This idea about trade-offs, I'm not going to say much about that. Before, I want to focus on thinking about stakeholders in relational terms. Too often, because we're influenced, I think, too much by a particular brand of economics, we see stakeholders engaged in transactions with each other and with the firm. And I want to argue that's a mistake, that a more useful unit of analysis would be to look at stakeholder relationships. And relationships are not transactions. And furthermore, I think relationships are not reducible to transactions. Relationships are about an assumption that it's going to continue. And in relationships, you don't keep score at the end of every day. If I were to walk down the hall here at Darden to my wife's office and say, "Hey, babe, we've been married 44 years and I think you're up 3. I think you owe me 3. I can tell you what the answer to that would be. She's a second-degree black belt in Taekwondo, so it wouldn't be particularly healthy for me. Well, why? You don't keep score. I mean, eventually you can determine whether a relationship makes sense or not. But if you keep score every day, you don't have a relationship, it seems to me. Same as stakeholders. There's got to be a presumption that it continues over time. And great companies, I think, do that. The only way to do this is continuous engagement, two-way conversations, etc. Purpose and profits, stakeholders and shareholders. The third idea is that business is embedded in society, not just in markets. So it's society and markets. We're pretty good at understanding the competitive pressures in looking at business embedded in markets, but they're also embedded in society. There's no way to abstract from that unless you look at business as sort of purely economic entities, and even that is hard to make some sense of. There's an abstraction that makes sense of that. It's called general equilibrium theory, as you all know, and that's a beautiful, wonderful abstraction, which is not very helpful in the real world. We have to worry about the institution of business and what its effect is on government, on education, on healthcare, on poverty, on inequality, on opportunity inequality, and gender inequality, and all kinds of societal issues. And if we don't do that, business gets left out of that equation, which in fact it affects a great deal. This is especially true with respect to, I think, certainly sustainability, but it's equally true with inequality and discrimination. One of the things I've been very impressed with is just capital. Of course, we can all find fault with the way they measure things, etc. But if you look that they're measuring how businesses are doing on things like racial inequality and Me Too, I think you'll find, at least I think that's a very healthy way to hold companies' feet to the fire here, as well as give them credit for the good stuff they do as opposed to only giving them credit for the bad stuff that they do. So, page here. Sustainability, if you think about those issues in the social world, there's always the problem of sort of crony capitalism. We've seen the rise of multi-sector, multi-stakeholder partnerships. And what we have to do is look at the institutional connections. We need a theory of the connection between business and government in a much more nuanced way than the ideological ones we have. And if you think about sustainability, then many of you know better than I do the challenges of doing that. In both cases, we need creative imagination. And it's here, I think, in the fourth idea, purpose and profits, stakeholders and shareholders, markets and society. And the fourth one is human beings are complex. We've got to understand human beings as fully human as well as economic. Both of those things are important. What's a human being? Think for a minute about what this is. It's an out-of-date iPhone, right? Well, how did this come about? Think about it for a minute. This didn't come about because there were a bunch of people out running around maximizing their own short-term self-interest. This came about because we as human beings invented some vocabularies to solve our problems. Think about the vocabularies we invented to get to an iPhone. We had to invent the vocabulary for metal. That didn't just fall off trees. We had to invent the vocabulary for glass. We had to invent the vocabulary and all of the physics that were in between. And then we had to cooperate together to make those work. Self-interest a part of that? Of course it is. Is our ability to cooperate together a part of it? Absolutely. Human beings are not just one-dimensional maximizers, even in sophisticated ways. Human beings are cooperators who invent vocabularies to solve their problems. And what becomes central here in the way business works is our ability to use the creative imagination, something that honestly we don't teach nearly enough of in our business schools to me. And finally, well, let me just say one more thing about the humanity stuff. I really get exercised about thinking of human beings as economic in entities only. Because anybody who's ever had a child or anybody who's ever even been in love knows we're capable of a tremendous amount more. Yes, we're capable of really horrid stuff. We're also capable of great acts of kindness. And human beings are complicated, and we need to take that into account, I think, in thinking about strategy. And finally, we need to put together business and ethics. Tell somebody you teach business ethics, they have to manage not to laugh. They say business ethics oxymoron. I didn't know business had any, must be a short course, theoretical subject. I think I've heard all of those things. I think the idea that we can separate business from ethics, or that we can separate normative from descriptive, is an idea that I thought when I showed up at Wharton in 1976, I thought that was an idea who was deader than Elvis. Philosophers killed it in the 40s, killed it several times again in the 50s, beat the dead horse in the 60s and 70s. And there it was, positivism alive and well at business schools. Facts, values, interpretation always all go together, and they have to. And that's something that, as we've adopted more what I would call, in the words of my late friend Richard Rorty, methodolatry, where we value method over content. That's a real problem. I think we need to be the generation of scholars that makes business better. Yes, part of that's more efficient. part of that's more competitive, but I mean normatively better, that allows us to live in a more diverse, more free world. That's our choice. Rorty has a interview, which if you don't know his work, one of the interviews is called "Take Care of Freedom, and Truth Will Take Care of Itself." And I will leave that as a tease. And in slightly under 30 minutes, be happy to answer your questions. But let me just preclude one, however, because this always happens. Does this pay? Does it pay in terms of the old story? So one of the people, lots of people ask that question, and my sense is how did trying to maximize shareholder value pay? How'd that work in the global financial crisis? Answer: not too well. It burned up several $1 trillion in value. Again, a better question, I think, is not does it pay? Is it guaranteed to pay? Refrigerators have guarantees, management theories don't. But is it possible that it pays? Is there proof of possibility? The proof of possibilities in. If you run your business this way, in line with these ideas, which I would call stakeholder capitalism. If you run your business this way, of course, it's possible that it pays. It's not necessary, but it is. I think the proof of possibility is pretty much in. Some of it done by people who are on the screen. So let me stop there. That really is just under half an hour.
Thanks a lot, Ed. Can we have a virtual round of applause? Great. So we'll now turn to Q&A. I have one question that I'll start with, and people can feel free to raise their hands, and I'll call on people. So Ed, thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it, and it's given me a lot to think about. One question that I had about this is that, the thesis of the book is that we need to, as I understand it, is that we need to break these binaries, these dichotomies, the 5 that you laid out. And you also in the book, you talk about this saints and sinners way of thinking about business and how that is destructive, which I find pretty compelling. At the same time, it seems to me that we're in a world where the thing that is governing a lot of corporate behavior with respect to attending to stakeholders and their needs is this kind of soft governance based on reputation, based on perceptions of attributed virtuousness or not to companies, that feels a lot like the saints and sinners thing. So I'm wondering, accepting that saints and sinners is an imperfect way of thinking about what companies really do and how they really affect stakeholders. If we were to get rid of this way of thinking about companies, how do we govern good behaviors towards stakeholders? Because it seems like in some ways that's the only thing that is preventing companies from acting like Freeman robots.
Well, I don't think so, Matthew. I think that's a question that's still in the grip of the old story. I know many companies who have people who are doing this because this is what they stand for. Do you talk about? If I were to say to you, the strategy course has said it's possible to be purpose driven, and all you're doing is trying to signal to your students, Matthew, that you're virtuous. That might be true. But it would seem to me that it might also be true that you actually believe this. I just don't think that it's possible for people to do stuff that they don't believe in continuously over time. Now, I think it's also nice when you have skeptical groups who are going to hold your feet to the fire. So I think that's straight, but I don't buy this is all just virtue signaling. That doesn't fit, at least with some of the executives that I know that are doing this. Are there people who are doing that? Absolutely. There's no question about that. Business is vast, and it's diverse, just like humanity. The saints and sinners thinking, for those of you that might not, Oscar Wilde solved that problem for us. He said, every saint's got a past and every sinner's got a future. There are very few people that are pure saints. I don't know any. And I don't know many that are pure sinners who are always trying to maximize their own short-term self-interest. There are people like that. We call them sociopaths. And then we elect them to high office. And I just want to say that's a nonpartisan statement coming from me. So I don't know, man. I tend to look at the virtue signaling stuff, and it's by people who don't want to believe that companies can actually do something good. If I were to say to all of you, look, we got this ethical issue we got to deal with right now. Is there anybody here who just thought, oh, somebody must have invented something really cool that makes our lives better? I'd be willing to say no. You thought something bad. You thought about, well, it's going to be something bad. But it just makes sense that if you get credit for the bad stuff, you get credit for the good stuff too. But we've seen business in this thing I call the business suck story for so long. It's very hard to get out of that. I'm sorry, I promised to have shorter answers.
Thanks, Ed. Okay, so we've got one question in the chat. Again, if others have questions, feel free to type it in the chat or raise your hand. Gunter, do you want to ask your question? Gunter is cameraless and muted, so I'll just ask his question for him. He asked, how can companies find a mechanism to distribute the value created fairly and justly among stakeholders?
So one of the ways, I think that's a hard question. It's a hard question because it depends on another dichotomy. It depends on the value creation, value distribution dichotomy, and that's another one that we need to lose. I think that permeates strategic management in a way that tethers it to the old story. In a relationship, value creation and value distribution are joint matters. And so if you focus too much on who gets what happens? Well, people might be a little hesitant to do much value creation. If you focus too much on we're just going to create value and not worry who gets what, so those things have to go. The creation and distribution questions have to go together, not, I think, be seen as sequential. I don't know how to think about that very much, but I think that's an interesting area to explore. In a lot of relationships, people don't think about, and here I mean relationships with stakeholders, companies don't think about who gets what. Eventually, if you don't get enough, then you have to end the relationship. But if you can think about creation, distribution together, so you're using your imagination to create as much value as you possibly can, and it's not somebody who's a taker who's just taking that from you, but it's joint. The value creation is joint. I think that's a better way to think about this. But again, I think there's a lot of work that can be done on this. For the most part, ask me a question about a dichotomy, and I'll say, this is kind of the general pragmatist response, don't like that dichotomy.
Cyrus, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, I'll try. And this is kind of following up because the argument's made out there that the idea is how the value is distributed. There's this question of property rights. And it's probably what I view as one of the stronger arguments with regard to how we manage our stakeholders and why shareholders and bondholders tend to win out more often, right? Because the framework's there, and we teach that framework all through finance, right? And I'm curious as to the corresponding stakeholder argument on using legal theory, right? Like how we can better sell the concept of stakeholders that don't have a direct legal claim to residuals, profit residuals. Just something to kick around with you, please.
Yeah. Well, my understanding of the law, again, which has been probably overly influenced by Lynn Payne, is that directors have a duty of care to the corporation, or in some places, the corporation and its shareholders, but the corporation for sure. And so what is that duty of care? I think it's to understand how stakeholder interests are joint and how they go together. And so again, I don't think this is particularly well understood. The other issue here, Cyrus, is to me, I'm not sure. We spend a lot of time worried about the sort of theory of the firm, and not much time worried about the main source of business on the planet, which is not large corporations, but is for the most part small family-oriented businesses, where I'm not sure how relevant relevant ideas like who has the residual are. I actually think paying attention to stakeholders means you do better for shareholders, but I don't. There's skepticism about that, and I realize that. If I were going to change something in corporate governance, I would look at how the capital markets work, where you can look at a company whose stock price is down, put it in play, and ruin it, and that seems to me to be not a very interesting way to do policy. So there's something wrong with that. I'm not sure what it was. I spent a long time trying to figure out how you rewrite the law of corporations, et cetera. And I finally came to the view that you didn't really need to do this, that paying attention to stakeholders was good management. And as long as management had duty of care of the corporation, it was fine to do that. And if you took a more narrow view that they should only care about shareholders, you were going to make a bunch of decisions that were bad, because there's too much uncertainty, there's too much bounded rationality in the world. So that's the way I left it for a long time. But there's something amiss in the capital markets regulation that I'm sure some of you know better than I do, where I can put a company like Whole Foods into play and force it out. The other thing we see here, which gives me a pause, is the decline of the public corporation. I mean, the number of public corporations, at least in the U.S., has declined precipitously. And so I don't really know the answer to your question. If I talk to the CEOs in conscious capitalism, they'll all say, look, what we're doing, creating value for stakeholders, that's in shareholders' interest. So call the residual whatever you want, doesn't matter. This is, in fact, those things go together.
Great. Cinziana?
Hi, Ed. Thanks,
Hi,
Matt.
Cinziana.
It's really lovely to see you and to hear you talk about this book. And I want to ask you a question that I saw John also posted right after Juan posted right after. It's a question that Anita McGann has been asking a lot lately. Like, where does it stop? Right at the very most inclusive sense of the word stakeholder, everybody is a stakeholder. So how do you think about that question?
Well, again, I have some pretty strong feelings about that. I've been criticized for, I don't know, 40 years or so I'm pretty immune to it now, about tell me exactly who's a stakeholder in every case, in every situation, for all possible businesses, for all times, here and forever. And as a pragmatist, I'm going to say that's a fool's errand. Depends on what problem you're trying to solve. If I'm trying to solve a problem like, what's our underlying business model here? I'm probably going to consider customers, suppliers, employees, communities, and people with money. Maybe there are others, but I'm going to consider those. If I'm trying to figure out, gee, what's the effect of House Resolution 4 in the California legislature on my wine business, I'm probably going to have a much finer grained idea about what that is. Are all of those really stakeholders? Well, I see theories as things that solve problems, not necessarily as things, in fact, not as things that represent the world the way it is all the time. So where the responsibilities in? Well, it depends on what problem you're trying to solve. If what you want to do is trying to solve a problem so that your company is a community builder, then it may turn out that you have to look at, for instance, as John Rawls would say, the least well off in society, in your community, and figure that out. If you see your company as not a community builder, but and not a community destroyer, but a company that does no harm, then it seems you might not have to look at the least well off. But I think those things are variable rather than you can answer them for businesses all the time. Where the responsibilities end is often on the other side, is often a rhetorical tactic to say, so we can't do ethics because this should go on forever. Where do you end? Well, no, the right question is why draw the line here versus here? And those are questions that are answerable. We teach our students to ask that question, and we don't take the rhetorical. And again, I don't know if Anita, I don't think she meant it like this, but I have heard people who meant it like, well, so you can't do ethics because anything goes and you never end. No, it's actually not right. Human beings are actually pretty good at doing this stuff. We solve it for our children all the time.
Can I push a little bit? I don't know how much you want this to be a conversation versus a series of Q&As.
Absolutely.
But oftentimes solving one problem opens up another one.
Sure.
Right.
Absolutely.
So then what? Right. So how do we think about these potentially kind of snowballing effects where solving a local problem just creates spillovers elsewhere? Well, sometimes it's down the road, literally down the road, the next community over, and sometimes it's down the road in a kind of temporal way.
Well, I would say if what I've done is now solve my problem by making it yours, that's not a very effective solution. And I would say, well, wait a minute. I can certainly affect you, and you get some say in that in a democratic world. In a relatively free society, if swinging your fist at my face is something that you think you're free to do, wait a minute, I get some say on that. That's what being a free society is. So look, there might be an unending stream of things. You find one problem, you create either other problems or opportunities, and that's life. Pragmatism says to us, what we're about is a kind of constant way to adjust means and ends, the way that we reason about things, and I'm pretty much attracted to that. As I did martial arts for many years, and as the master said to a student once, he said, "I don't have the problem of wanting to have no problems." And sometimes I feel like we try to build theories so we get rid of all our problems. I don't know how to do that. So that's the best I got, Susanna.
No, that's great. Thanks.
I'm going to exercise a little bit of editorial discretion here and pick two questions that I think are somewhat related, and I'll just sort of paraphrase these. So Ruth asks, she says she's been reading Andrea Scher and Jean-Yves Gomez's work on deliberative governance. How does the voice of stakeholders fit into the framework? And then Aline also asks about how do we assess relationships as opposed to transactions, and how do we evaluate the quality of these exchanges? And so I think both of these questions get to how do we address the aspiration that you laid out about going beyond just this transactional, maybe unidirectional relationship where the firm is managing the stakeholder, to realizing this aspiration of an ongoing dyadic or multilateral relationship?
Well, those are great questions, and I think Ruth and Aline are probably better able to answer those than I am. But I think you've got to figure out in a way what it means to have this sort of relational point of view. One of the pieces of that is precisely how does voice work? And what are the sort of conditions for voice? It's interesting. Again, I oftentimes think about this in terms of my family, and thinking about how I encourage voice in children who oftentimes may not see themselves as being able to speak with the same authority as parents. Surely there are also stakeholders who are voiceless. There's stakeholders in communities who are the least well off. Some companies treat employees as voiceless. I think gradually we're beginning to understand that's a dumb way to manage, but nonetheless they do. I haven't read Andrea's work on deliberative governance, so I don't know, but certainly managing stakeholders, I think, was an unfortunate metaphor. It's the engagement of them, and I originally had the management metaphor only because I saw what I was doing as a theory of strategy, as about how executives should manage. It's much more about engagement. And again, it's much more about what the intersection of those interests turn out to be, and how one looks at the how they're interconnected. People say all the time, well, look, there's a problem with how do you measure this stuff? And I actually think measuring it's easy. What's hard to measure is the intersection. I think that's actually a tricky business to figure out. I don't see these. I just see in the chat Ruth's question about are these symmetrical? I really haven't thought about that. These were there were 5 ideas. Maybe there should be 4 or 6. I don't know. They were the best I could come up with, and with Bobby and Kirsten, they were the best I could come up with what all of these sort of revisions of capitalism seem to have in common. It's at least the way that I would say it. I'm probably most happy with the sort of conscious capitalism way John Mackey and Raj Sisodia put it. I'm on the board there, so I'm biased, but it's a big, it's got to be a big tent. If we're going to change the old story, it's going to take generations. Think about how long we've been trying to change the story that men and women are morally equal. We've been trying to change that for 100 years or more. And, we made some progress, but but there's a long way to go.
Terrific. So we've got about 8 minutes left. I'm gonna again draw on one of the questions in the chat, and then I'm gonna also ask one of my own. And then if you have any concluding remarks, Ed. So Doug asked, I think, a really good question. In terms of a theory connecting business and government, what are promising ideas or questions that you've come across lately? I think a lot of us would be interested in that. And I also wanted to go back to something that you said at the very beginning about thinking that it's important to bring a more normative perspective into business scholarship. And I'd like to hear you talk about that a little bit more. And in particular, what your process vision for that is. So in your positive vision of a business scholarship that involves and is more permissive of a normative approach, what does that look like? And how do we get there? Is this a matter of hiring more philosophers in business schools? Is this
Please
a matter
don't.
of, okay, so maybe not that one, but okay, if not that, then what is the path?
Well, Doug's question first. I've started to look at the idea of thinking about government not only as referee, not only as redistributor, both of which are important, but thinking about governments as how they can facilitate value creation. Governments can facilitate value creation, and many of them, there's a lot of experimentation going on with incubators and accelerators and those kinds of things. But things like civil rights legislation facilitates value creation because it opens up possibilities for people that haven't had them. One of my favorite examples is in the US, the Surgeon General's report on smoking and health. Think about how much value that created. People live longer, et cetera. If you're worried about the tobacco companies, they figured out how to survive that, et cetera. So thinking about how governments can facilitate value creation is, I think, an interesting way to think about this. I think we need to do that, certainly in schools. We need to become a nation of entrepreneurs much more than we are. And I think governments, again, don't think about government as the national government, that's broken. Think about governments as their ability to do that. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff that's to be done on that. On the normative side, I would say, Matt, I wouldn't call it permissive. I would say it's about recognizing what really goes on. In 1945 in Chicago, Enrico Fermi was about to detonate the Chicago pile, first nuclear reaction ever. Okay, there was a non-zero, very tiny, but non-zero probability that when he torched off the Chicago pile, the atmosphere would turn to sand. And that would be like it for us. Now, again, it was very small. But as a physicist, he had to decide, as a scientist, he had to decide if the probability was big enough to do the experiment or not. So he had to make a value judgment, right? And you want the scientists to make it because they're the only ones that really understand what 10 to the minus 200 is or whatever it turned out not to be, whether the experiment goes forward or not. And And the experiments are what scientists do. It eventually gets collected as theory, but it's about what things are, what you're able to do. Now, if in physics we can't escape that, it seems to me by the time we get down the food chain to strategy, we ought to be pretty clear about that. I've always said, look, the stakeholder idea, the very word itself is a judgment. It says you have a stake. It's a play on shareholders. Replace the H and the R with a T and a K. And so it doesn't, you can't escape the normative piece of it. It's a brilliant book, which I would recommend to all of you. You don't have to read the whole thing even. It's called, what's it called? It's called The End of the Fact Value Dichotomy by Hilary Putnam. It's a very small book. And Putnam makes the sort of pragmatist argument that you really can't separate facts from values. So I think people see, when I say value, normative research, people see that I got to take a stand on some interesting social issue. You can do that, and I don't see anything wrong with that. But I think it's about just understanding what's implicit in the theoretical moves that you make, and that's what I mean by that. And I think the journals are a problem here. It was a problem. I edited Journal of Business Ethics for 5 years, and there was a problem there. And you don't have to be a critical management scholar or an ethicist to do that. I think looking at all of our frameworks and strategy and just pointing out the sort of normative assumptions would be important to do. Can I just make 2 quick points here at the end? First point is I want to call your attention to and invite you to be a guest on the Stakeholder podcast. It's something that I've started. There are about 55 episodes so far. It's everyone from CEOs to stakeholder theorists to a few students to people working in the world and doing interesting things. You can find it. This is a straight ad. You can find it wherever you find podcasts. It's called the Stakeholder Podcast, and all of you would be terrific guests. We do one every week. So if you have any interest at all, and even if you don't, I'm probably going to put the arm on you because I now have the list of who's here. The second thing is we have for 2 years, Doug and John Bundy know this, and there may be others who have come, a sort of stakeholder seminar in the summer. We do it the week before the academy for doctoral students and early career scholars. And we have people like Doug and John Bundy and Rob Phillips and a whole bunch of other people come. Vit Hennis has been here, and Sybil Sachs and a bunch of others. We have that. We're going to do it this year. So it'll be the week before, given that COVID's okay. It'll be the week before the Academy of Management. So if you have doctoral students or yourselves or young colleagues or early career colleagues, not too young, who would benefit from this, what we ask people to do is to bring a paper that they're working on stakeholder theory. And then what we ask them to do is to start a new paper with one of the people they meet at the seminar, so that they at least leave with two papers on the way. So with those ads, thank you, Matthew, for having me.
Thank you, Ed. Another round of applause, please. It has been wonderful to have you here.
Thanks.
I want to just close. Robin gave me a great reminder. There's a SurveyMonkey survey where you can provide feedback about today's session. And also the SMS Stakeholder Strategy Interest Group business meeting is on September 2nd, and there's more information in the chat about that as well. Hope to see you all there. Hope to see you at the next one of these. We don't know yet exactly when that'll be, but we've got some interesting speakers in the works. If you've got other suggestions, books that are coming out of things you think we should look at, please feel free to shoot Jiao or I an email about that. But again, thank you very much, Ed, for joining us. And I hope everyone has a great day.